This month I had a couple of jobs running in the shop, one a little bit of work and the other a bit of play, trying to balance the two as I went along. This first job, well, I made this table and chairs about a year ago, but I missed out one of the stools and had some friends coming to stay soon, and they will need to sit down, so I need to get on with that. I had a few pieces of oak left over from the table, just enough to put this together. It's a pretty simple build, a top, two sides held together by a stretcher, and I'm just cutting them down here, trimming them to size and gluing them up into panels. Once that was done, I set them to dry and I could get on with the fun part of the month. A while ago I made a little sculpture. It was about 30 centimeters high. It was in sort of an abstract form made of 3 blocks and some little textured inserts. And I was looking at it recently and saw it in a different way. I saw it as a figure rather than an abstract form. And so based on that I decided that I'd remake it, but remake 3 of them and make them almost life-size. After working on some sketches, I decided to make a group of 3 of these. One I'm hoping will be around 6 feet tall and the other 2 slightly smaller. I'm hoping they're going to look really good when they're photographed outside in the environment. I'll maybe hike them right up onto the moor or to the woods. I think they'll have kind of a spectral presence, and I'm calling them the visitors. The central column will be made out of this ash, which I'm just planing down and cutting to a rough size. It's very pale, almost white at times, and I think it'll look very nice when contrasted with a darker wood. I already had a pretty good idea of what these were going to look like from doing some sketches, but when I cut down the ash I didn't quite have as much as I thought. Sometimes it's good to work with some restrictions though, and you sort of have to compromise and try new things, get a little bit more creative with the composition. So I spent some time cutting down some blocks, moving things around and just trying to find a balance for the 3 pieces that felt right. After a lot of rearranging these blocks and moving things around and looking at them from different angles, I actually ended up going back to my original sketches. In the meantime, I had a nice new old book arrive in the post. Kenneth and Mary Martin. This is a book of their sketches and preparatory drawings. They made a lot of beautiful abstract work in the 50s and 60s. They made mostly 3-dimensional work, sculptures, relief sculptures and mobiles. They used a lot of mathematical equations and geometrical rules to create their work, which is very different to how I produce my stuff, but nonetheless I find this really fascinating. And I always really love looking at artists' sketches and the way they plan their work. This is a really beautiful book. The next day these glue panels were dry and I scraped off any excess glue, gave them a rough sand and started trimming them down to size so they were ready for joining. This is a fairly simple construction for this stool. 2 side panels joined together by 3 stretchers, 1 down low and 2 up underneath the seat, and then the seat panel that sits on top. Relatively simple, but should be very strong. I'm using a Festool domino for this construction. It is not a cheap tool by any stretch of the imagination, but it does make this kind of work very quick and easy and repeatable. If you can get your hands on some Festool equipment on sale, used, second-hand, it's really well worth it. It's the best. To make finishing these a little easier, I've done most of the sanding before the glue up. So I'm taking the time to put some blue tape around all the joints. This will help catch any glue that squeezes out and stop it going onto the finished wood. It's always a pain when you've completed a job and then there's little smears of glue and drips of glue on the finished wood. There'll probably be a few spots here and there regardless, but this should make things a little bit easier. And once I managed to get this all locked together and got some clamps on, it was ready to be left to dry up. Always try not to over clamp things, just make sure all the joins are seated nicely and the glue is squeezing out. Whilst waiting for the glue on the seats to set up, I could get back to working on the sculptures, and I began the process of trying to lock these sections together, cutting pieces out of the central column and cutting grooves and dados out of some of the blocks, trying to find a way that they would lock together and so they'd feel like a cohesive piece. I didn't want these blocks to feel like they were just stuck onto the surface of these columns. I wanted them to sort of lock together so it felt like they were one piece. Using the table saw and the miter saw to cut the recesses in these blocks gets you sort of 90% of the way there, but you've got to go in with a chisel and maybe do a bit of sanding just to trim things exactly so they'll click together and really fit nicely. I was at the stage now that I could stand these up and take a look at them. With the use of a few clamps holding the blocks in place, I can start to fine-tune their placement. It's hard to say exactly what I'm looking for here, it's just kind of finding a balance between the blocks and the central column and their relationship with each other. Maybe there's a little bit of tension, maybe there's a little bit of space that needs to be added here or there. There's also the practical consideration of making sure that they are physically balanced, that the blocks on either side of the column don't tip them one way or another. That turned out pretty well at the end. The lower blocks in each of them sort of counterlevered out a little bit, and they balanced pretty nicely. But before I could get into finishing off the sculptures and the seat, I had to take a little trip over to Sheffield. I'd had some work in a gallery there for a few weeks and I just needed to pick it up. Two things I never miss when I go to Sheffield. One is to stop in at Steam Yard for a nice cup of coffee, delicious cortado. And the other is to go, well, just next door to Bear Tree Records. Definitely the best record shop in town. Has a particularly good collection of weird electronic ambient stuff. Some really nice things. So after I picked up my work from the gallery, I headed home and it was time to get this seat finished. Now the glue was dried up, I took off the tape and gave it a final sanding. I'm using an Osmo Poly-X oil. I think this is the semi-matte clear finish, and it goes on pretty easily. It really makes the grain pop. I put 2 coats on the sides and the base and 3 on the seat that will get most wear. It's really durable and can always be refinished later if needs be. Once this was done, it was just a case of letting it dry and then screwing the top on, and it was all set. And this job that I've been putting off for the best part of a year was done, which is a bit of a relief, and I can move back to working on the sculptures. And now it's time to get these pieces glued together. I wanted a thin line running up the center of each column to create a little recess. So I'm using this piece of plywood with the edges coloured black. It's glued and pin nailed in place, and then the other half of the column is glued on top of that and held in place with clamps. I had to glue these up in stages, doing the bottom half of the columns first, and then the top, and then putting the blocks in place. Just like in the first sculpture I made, I want to add a line of organic texture to these sculptures. So I'm using these pinecone scales. They'll eventually be inset into the groove that was formed by the plywood spacer between the 2 central columns. I had to be very careful in removing all of these. If you pull them out, they can split, and that's no good. So I had to take the time to slice each one off very carefully, and I quickly realised that I was going to need a lot of these. Fortunately, I'd set aside a few of these that I'd picked up last winter, so I had plenty in the end. But it did take a long time to slice each and every one of these out. For the 2 smaller columns, I used the pinecone, but for the larger one, I used the scales from Monkey Puzzle. And they were a lot easier to break away. They just snapped off pretty easily. I then took the time to clean each piece and coat them in a wax finish. This really brought out the colour and gave them a lovely shine. This should also help preserve them over time to stop them drying out and crumbling. By the following day, the glue had dried on the sculptures, and I was able to sand them down and get them ready to put some finish on. I used the same oil wax finish that I'd used on the scales, and while I was really happy with how this looked on the darker wood, the blocks of Iroko, the ash, it yellowed it a little bit too much. It looked okay here, but the next day when I came back into the workshop, the ash had yellowed quite a lot, so I ended up sanding those back to preserve the more white look. After a couple of days, the wax had dried and I brought these indoors where it's a little less dusty, so I could work on inserting the scales into the recess. To hold the scales in place, I'm using a bead of this dark brown cork. It's actually designed to fill in the gaps in floorboards and dries very slowly, which is useful because that gives you plenty of time to put things in place, move them around, and make sure they're positioned just right. I think it actually takes up to a week or maybe more to dry completely, so they're a little fragile for a while, but it does give you plenty of working time. And this was really the final stage, getting all these little pieces set in the right place and allowing them to dry for a couple of days, and then taking them out and taking some photographs. I'm really pleased with the way they turned out. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you enjoyed watching me making them. See you next time.